This talk is entitled Lies, Lies, and More Lies. We live in a day and age where, as Goebbels said, Hitler's minister of propaganda, if you tell the people a lie often enough, they will believe it. Recently, the president of the Institute for Creation Research, ICR, opened the May 2021 magazine with an article entitled Refusing to Live by Lies. This article had the word government above it with an arrow pointing to where the lies were coming from. ICR is an organization started 50 years ago by scientists who wanted to bring out that all the scientific evidence points to a creation that occurred about 6,000 years ago and that was disrupted by a global flood. The magazine's circulation is over 300,000, and they have opened a modern state-of-the-art museum in Dallas, Texas, where families, school groups, and anyone wanting honest evidence about what the Bible says about God's creation can come and see it. You may ask yourself, how can there be so much evidence for creation and we Christians know so little of it? Where you go for water when you're thirsty, for knowledge will determine how well you're hydrated. Today, Christians send their children to government schools where lies have been crafted for almost 2 centuries to have their children trained in a disbelief of creation and the Creator. Even home schools are designed to be government schools at home when the Christians follow the government mandate for what the children must be taught. Science, better known as lies, is on the menu to be fed the nation's children. The Bible calls it science, falsely so called. True science is a truth about what nature says exists and has existed. True science is everywhere to see if you're educated to read its report. Crafting lies is an art that those who hate God have developed over the millennium. Lies require a foundation of ignorance in order to be developed into colossal monuments to our ignorance. God speaks to us in a still small voice. To everyone is imparted the spirit of truth. No one is left out. Other voices clamor in our minds to be heard, but God never pushes his thoughts to the forefront. We must be willing to take the quiet time that is necessary to hear his voice. When one's heart desires to know truth, they can live it. God will send the truth. Now, what must we do when we realize lies are so thick around us that we can hardly breathe without taking them in? Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a Russian dissident who was sent to a prison camp in Siberia because he would not believe government lies, said this: "For when people renounce lies, lies simply cease to exist. Like parasites, they can only survive when attached to a person." I was asked by a 26-year-old Seventh-day Adventist woman how I could explain vestigial organs in the human body. She was a very sincere, godly young lady, but had been trained to be a dietitian and was working as one at a hospital. She was working in the oncology or cancer section of the hospital. I hope she had not gotten her education in Seventh-day Adventist schools, but she may have. Vestigial organs are organs in the human body that evolutionists say have no purpose. The appendix is claimed to be one. This evolutionary lie that the appendix has no purpose is sheer ignorance. The appendix is situated so it can re-inoculate the intestine with the body's specific microbiome delivered to the person by their mother at birth. We all have a microbiome like fingerprints. What species live in our gut can indicate what our family line is through our mother. These microbe species are designed to keep us healthy. When they're changed, our health changes. The appendix stores some of them to re-inoculate our gut after a bout of dysentery or some other violent cleansing of the gut. Our personal microbiome is the best suited to reestablish our health after that cleansing. Before antibiotics, before antibiotic use, it is now being stored in a stool bank before any surgery or procedures that require antibiotics, which kill off one's gut microbiome. It is saved. After the antibiotic use ceases, your specific microbiome is used again to re-inoculate your gut. Where were the Seventh-day Adventist doctors and educated friends when this young lady needed them? Obviously, they, in their supposed wisdom, had not been renouncing the lies that they had heard. Weakness to speak truth is the reason evolution has reached such epic proportions in a nation that called itself Christian. Lies are not renounced by God's people, so lies take deep root in our children. The question to ask ourselves is, are we really God's people when we don't renounce lies? When we let these parasites infest our children, are we truly the family of God? A true family protects its children, and not just with lip service to the children, but by openly renouncing the lies for the children to see what they should be doing, renouncing lies also. Now, cancer has been growing in leaps and bounds over the decades. For decades, the Cancer Society has been collecting money to, quote, cure cancer. Ty and Charlene Ballinger have created a website called The Truth About Cancer. They show over a dozen ways in which people have cured cancer. They interview cancer clinics and physicians from all over the English-speaking world who cure cancer. Ty lost his father to cancer after going through the United States accepted cancer treatments by oncologists, only to find out later how it was treatable and could have been reversed and healed. Lies in the medical field, lies in the classroom, lies from government officials fill our world with sickness and disease because treating people but not curing people is the most profitable business on earth today. Like another very profitable business, war, millions of lives are sacrificed to make phenomenal profits. Yet, when people renounce lies, lies simply cease to exist. Like parasites, they can only survive when attached to a person. Recently, I was explaining to someone who had Lyme disease how eating foods known for their protein content bring on a Lyme attack of painful joints. I was told, but you need protein. When I explained the protein myth that was developed by corrupt government officials, President Johnson was caught taking bribes from the meat and milk industry, the response was disbelief. I remember decades ago how the myth that you need to watch protein in your diet had been laid to rest. I thought that lie had been done away with. To see the young generation still clinging to that lie really made me wonder. It seems the spreaders of lies know Goebbels' trick to deceive the public. Tell a lie often enough and the people will believe it. Lies are as persistent as the desire for money. Money makes the world go round is an old saying, a saying with great truth in it. Where money can be made, people will lie. When the government food chart was showing that a 150-pound person needed 65 grams of protein a day, Dr. Agatha Thrash of UT Pines, the Seventh-day Adventist Health Institute, was saying a 150-pound person needed 5 grams of protein a day. And she said, that's on the conservative side. Actually, about 12 grams is all that is needed. It is impossible to get too little protein when you eat food from God's creation. If you eat processed foods that have the protein taken out, you could possibly have problems. Now the charts are down to 43 grams for a 150-pound person per day. Still, 3 times what the conservative figure is. Dr. Agatha Thrash was not only started the Health Institute, but as a side job was the county coroner. It was her job to determine for the courts the cause of death. When the myth of high protein needs were being pushed, a baby of a vegan mother died. The press all over the United States reported that it died from a lack of protein because the mother was vegan. This was during the days of great ignorance. Dr. Thrash, being a coroner for the county, requested the study on the baby to review it herself. She reviewed it, and it showed serious problems with the baby that had nothing to do with protein needs. Government power can say what it wants to say. Only by refusing to live by lies, by renouncing them, can these parasites be eliminated from the public's mind. Parasites have seeds. Money waters that seed so it can germinate and grow elsewhere. Lies will be a never-ending problem as long as this wicked world lasts. Yet, we can keep our family's garden free of this weed by diligently renouncing lies. Are you opening your mouth to declare righteousness, or are you one of the silent majority? Silence is the death knell of truth. Country living is declared by God's prophet in Ministry of Healing, page 183 to 185, to be God's plan for all the sheep of his pasture. And that, quote, to the world's departure from it is owing to a large degree the poverty and wretchedness that exists today, end quote. Children grow up today being entertained in school to keep their attention, and entertained by the TV and now computer games. The excitement these games create cause a little drop of dopamine to develop in the brain. Like heroin, it creates a pleasurable sensation. They become electronic drug addicts and become miserable without their heroin-like fix. Like experimental rats, modern generations have been programmed to need electronic gadgets to emotionally survive. The joys of creation's beautiful sunsets, its fragrant smells, its delicious taste, its melodious sounds, and its tender caresses of the sun's rays on a chilly day, or cool breezes on a hot day, or the pillowy feel of a mullein leaf, have no place in their technological world. Grandparents trying to get them to experience the joys they once felt in nature find it as difficult as pulling teeth. For the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross, Hebrews 12:2 tells us. Count it all joy when you suffer persecution for righteousness' sake, the Bible also tells us. How can children find joy in suffering when they can find no joy in the pleasures and delights of an Edenic landscape? We are preparing our children for slaughter when Jesus comes by giving them these devices to entertain themselves. God has provided pleasure and delight for our lives by designing an Edenic homestead that continually be improved generation after generation. I recall an African fellow testifying where he lives on his family's homestead. He had never seen one. The bounty of trees that shaded the area never ceased to produce their family's needs. The family had created a food forest to live in. I saw a food forest in Morocco in a dry, scrubby landscape, according to a drone view of it, that supported 80 families since the time it was established. That was 2,000 years ago during the Roman Empire. Food forest designs that create an Edenic landscape are still in existence. But do the children still desire it? Or are they enticed away from it by Babylon's education that creates a desire for the goodly and dainty things of Revelation 18:14? The sorcerers and their sorceries spoken of in Revelation are pharmaceutical enticements away from God, technologically induced drug addictions that make God's pleasures and delight empty and despised, are used by Babylon to prepare for destruction as many as it can. Sorcerers and sorceries, pharmakon and pharmakia in the Greek, druggists and medication in English from the Strong's Concordance, are the accepted lifestyle for Babylon's inhabitants. God's looking for a people willing to come out of Babylon's lifestyle to the Edenic lifestyle he created for our first parents. Will you be one of them? The truth is, it will be hard work to rebuild Eden's design. It's no lie that there will be much sweat, blood, and tears. When I first cleared my family's land in multiflora rose, I always came away bloody. Now I'm finding some multiflora rose plants without thorns. I'm leaving them. The robins enjoy the rose hips and spread the seed. Eden restored is the truth for God's people today. If you don't have a demonstration plot to bring people to to see how they can come out of Babylon, and all you offer is prayer to relieve the misery that Babylon's lifestyle brings on, you're only doing half the job you're called to perform, to call people out of Babylon. God does not just want his people to teach the sick and dying of cancer how to pray their way through the suffering of dying from it. He wants the truth about cancer, like Ty and Charlene Ballinger are presenting, that cancer is curable, taught to the sick and dying. Without our country home as a lifestyle center to bring people to see and to teach people to create for themselves, we have only half a message to come out of Babylon. Babylon is a real lifestyle. It brings on sickness and disease from poor quality foods and a poisoned environment. It is home so full of poison that it takes years for the materials to finish off-gassing. It is places with little greenery or suburban greenery laced with Roundup-coated lawns and sprayed trees and bushes. It is clothing made from the technological wizardry of synthetic fibers rather than simple natural fibers like cotton, linen, wool, and hemp. Healthfulness is the right arm of the third angel's message to bring people to God. Country living is the lifestyle center that heals sick minds and bodies. It is surrounded by God's pleasing delights for mankind. Lying advertisements entice and entrap healthy people in Babylon's sickening and poisoned lifestyle. So shouldn't we have a complete alternative? Not just a mental solution to its suffering like only prayer? Once the lie that Babylon has a better way to live is exposed, what's holding us back from living the truth? Every Seventh-day Adventist, everyone who cares for their fellow man, everyone whose heart goes out to the needy, needs to search their heart as to why God's lifestyle is not grasped with both hands. Not enough money is always a convenient excuse. I think of a young couple in Oklahoma who had just married. They had no savings, but they wanted God's lifestyle. They cut every bill possible, and on a landscaper's salary of about $15 an hour, they saved $5,000 in 7 months. They prayed to find land and looked at a piece they liked. They sought out the owner, who lived in Texas and had not seen it for 60 years. They called and told their desire to buy the few acres, but that they only had $5,000 cash. She said yes, she'd sell it to them, but called back later and said she was told it was worth much more. But she said, I'll sell it to you anyways. They moved onto the property and lived in a tent, and the wife was carrying a baby. A month later, a neighbor who saw their living conditions said, I have an old travel trailer I'd like to give you. They cleared and planted the land, but with all that zeal, they were soon recruited for the mission field. You don't need to be young to move to the country. The elderly have accumulated possessions and can finance a place and bring a young family with them, with their strength, to live with them. Sister White says in these last days, press together, press together. Babylon's induced sickness from poison in our food and stressful living to technological addictions and warped emotional desires has been lyingly declared mankind's modern success story. We're in a new age, a brave new world, a better life than dirt farmers ever had. You can feed a person dog manure if you put enough excitotoxins in it and make it look delicious, but it's still dog manure. Seventh-day Adventists are to be declaring to the world that God's way to live is God's desire for his people's happiness. Instead, they send their children to government schools to be trained in lies so they can have an education to fit into Babylon's economy. Country living is despised by most unless it's a Martha Stewart lifestyle. God's schoolroom, written about in Ellen G. White's book, Education, is replaced with Babylon's schoolroom and lesson books. And the parents are very proud of their children's success in these schools. The first paragraph in the book Education says it all. Quote, our ideas of education take too narrow and too low a range. There is a need of a broader scope, a higher aim, True education means more than the pursuit of a certain course of study. It means more than a preparation for the life that now is. It has to do with the whole being and with the whole period of existence possible to man. It is a harmonious development of the physical, the mental, and the spiritual powers. It prepares the student for the joy of service in this world and for the higher joy of wider service in the world to come. True education is an education in service. Putting God's children in a school where they're taught to compete for grades, to be able to get into a better college, where survival of the fittest is taught, does not prepare them for the joy of service. In these schools, joy is taught to be conquest, and one is supposed to be better off than the so-called uneducated subsistence farmer. Yet the landscape that the subsistence farmer works on is called God's schoolroom in the first paragraph of the second chapter in the book Education. Quote, "The system of education instituted at the beginning of the world was to be a model for after time." Did you catch that? This system of education was to be a model for us and our children forever. It continues, "An illustration of its principles, a model school was established in Eden, the home of our first parents. The Garden of Eden was the schoolroom. Nature was the lesson book. The Creator himself was the instructor, and the parents of the human family were the students." End quote. Are you and your children in this everlasting school? In the last paragraph of this chapter, it says, quote, "The Garden of Eden was a representation of what God desired the whole earth to become." End quote. Are you working on God's desire for the whole earth to become a Garden of Eden? Or are you striving for Babylon's Martha Stewart landscape for your American dream home? It continues, "And it was God's purpose that as the human family increased in numbers, they should establish other homes and schools like the one he had given. Thus, in course of time, the whole earth might be occupied with homes and schools where the words and the works of God should be studied, and where the students should thus be fitted more and more fully to reflect through endless ages the light of the knowledge of God's glory." Now, the first paragraph of the book, Desire of Ages, by Ellen White, gets right to the point of what the light of the knowledge of God's glory is. Quote, "His name shall be called Emmanuel, God with us. The light of the knowledge of the glory of God is seen in the face of Jesus Christ. From the days of eternity," isn't this schoolroom to be an eternal classroom? "From the days of eternity, the Lord Jesus Christ was one with the Father. He was the image of God, the image of his greatness and majesty, the outshining of his glory. It was to maintain this glory that he came to our world." End quote. Are you maintaining this glory in your children by the school you send them to? Do they come out of school behaving like Jesus, desiring to live their lives as servants to their fellow man? Or do they come out desiring to acquire the American dream? Ministry of Healing 183 through 184 says that God's solution for, quote, "help for the unemployed and the homeless," end quote, was that every family had a home on the land with sufficient ground for tilling, and that this supplies both the means and the incentive for a useful, industrious, and self-supporting life. True education teaches a lifestyle of service. It teaches a man to fish for life rather than to give him a fish to eat for a day. Every Seventh-day Adventist is to have a home lifestyle center to demonstrate God's way to live in our lives. A home on the land with sufficient ground for growing vegetables and planting trees of nuts and fruits. God's lifestyle center for every family is an eternal model, not just for a home, but for an eternal school that trains the persons living in it to manifest the glory of Jesus, self-sacrificing service. This service is true education. Our children are to be educated to serve their fellow man as Jesus came and showed us how. He was, quote, God with us, end quote, showing us what our lives were to be educated into. Without the eternal schoolroom and Edenic landscape that we're to make for ourselves and every new family, without that eternal schoolroom, how can you expect to please God? Can we come up with a better educational program than God? Jesus has not come again. He does not have 144,000 educated in his ordained schoolroom with his ordained lesson book. What do you think it means to, quote, strive to be among the 144,000, end quote? Maybe we ought to do things God's way, like enter his school. A lifestyle center home in the country demonstrates God's way to live. It is not only our homes, but our schoolroom, landscape for all to see and taste. This is God's calling for all his people. At the expense of sounding more redundant than I already have been, God's schoolroom must be our homesteads. Country living can be Babylon in the country. Understanding God's plan for modern Israel, as Ministry of Healing 183 to 185 spells out, is a must-do for Jesus to come. He has not delayed his coming. We have delayed it by not entering the schoolroom he planned for our character development. Nature is a wonderful lesson book. It teaches more than beauty, melodiousness, deliciousness, smells, and how things feel. It teaches how to successfully learn the joy of service. It teaches God's wisdom and not man's wisdom. It has far-reaching lessons that we will continue learning about into eternity. God's design will not change on the earth made new. God's design here and now is that all creatures' activities serve those in their sphere of influence. Service will always be God's transcript of his character in nature's lessons book. What will change is that there will be no repair service. All will stay perfect. Pleasure and delight will never be disrupted again. So why not begin now to work to create Eden restored? We'll be working for eternity to maintain Eden restored. Get to know its ways today. Learn to see Jesus in activities of service. Be inspired by nature's activities of service. Let its thinking be in you that was also in Christ Jesus. That concludes my talk on lies, lies, and more lies.